couples therapist who specializes in trauma and codependency, and reading the book Normal People by Sally Rooney left me incredibly sad recently. And I think that's because this book deals very well in some ways with mental health and trauma and how it impacts our view of ourselves and what kind of relationships we are willing to be a part of. But it ended in a way that felt incredibly unresolved for me. And to close the loop, so to speak, I'm going to talk about the character of Marianne in Normal People and how I would think of her as a trauma therapist and the goals I might work towards with her as a client. Firstly, if you've read Normal People or not, the character Marianne has a complex backstory, which I really appreciate it. Sally Rooney is a great writer. She did a great job filling these characters out. And, as a trauma therapist, some of the key things to me to know are that Marianne's father is now deceased. We don't really know the details of that, but he was physically abusive to her. She said sometimes is the only amount that we know of, the only details. But we do know that her brother, she still lives with at the beginning of the book and then visits home and sees him, he is physically abusive at times. He has spit on her, he demeans her. At one point, trigger warning throughout this video for some hard realities, but he even encourages her to no longer live. And her mother was quoted as saying by Marianne that all she told her brother was, don't encourage her. And so we know that mom is also emotionally abusive. There's some really good quotes throughout the book that really highlight that Marianne's mother thinks it's kind of the norm for men to be physically abusive, and she thinks that her daughter lacks warmth for kind of going numb to this, and really sees her daughter as unlovable and is very critical towards her. So we know that she comes from an abusive home. She has an on-again, off-again relationship with a young man named Connell, and she views relationships through this lens of power. She talks about men wanting to dominate her being submissive to different men at different times, even engaging in more violent, intimate encounters. And at one point she is explaining that she thinks she's a bad person, so sometimes she thinks she deserves bad treatment. She has a codependent view of relationships, which means that in this case, she at one point thinks of Connell as redeeming her. So there's kind of a rescuer complex sometimes with codependency, where you don't think of relationships as equal partners. There's someone who needs to be rescued, and then there's this rescuer. And then finally, she has symptoms of an eating disorder where she will restrict throughout the day from her food. And that's my dog, if you heard him. And so I mentioned that she thinks she's a bad person. She has this narrative of herself throughout the novel. And Sally Rooney does a wonderful job describing Marianne's dissociation throughout the novel. There's some really good quotes in this where at one point you read that Marianne feels like she lives through a protective film and that nothing really touches inside of her. And then at another point, she describes how she's surprised when other people interact with her because she's surprised that she's real to them. And dissociation is also called the frozen state, if you're familiar with fight, flight, freeze, the trauma response, polyvagal theory. So she has a strong, pervasive experience of being dissociative or numb or frozen. And that can reinforce where some of these more violent relationships might not impact her in the same way as if she was really kind of embodied and sensitive to what was going on inside of her. And so if I was working with her as her therapist, of course, clients always collaborate with the therapist. They're the ones guiding the treatment plan. But I would specifically want to focus on treating her sense of disassociation and her narrative that she's a bad person. You know, research shows that if you have physical abuse growing up, if you've experienced that, you are more likely to have a negative view of yourself, to have lower self-esteem, which I think is pretty intuitive to most of us. That makes sense. You know, a lot of times when traumatic things happen, we think that it's our fault. You know, for example, if my father thought I was worth hitting, then I must be worth less. Like, there's something wrong with me if my dad thought that I deserve to be hit. And so people who are abused tend to pick up the narrative, the story that they're a bad person. And then because of that, that tends to influence the choices that they make, you know, like thinking that she deserves to be with aggressive or violent men, or not knowing how to be intimate. For example, at one point she asked Connell to hit her when they're being intimate. And it's really because she believes she's bad. So that reinforces the type of treatment that she thinks she needs from others, which then cultivates more unhealthy experiences, reinforcing that narrative. And so the disassociation and narrative would be key targets for me in her treatment. And to target disassociation, I think it's super important to think about that freeze state. People go into this powerless, numb place to survive. But then once we become numb to our experiences, we end up experiencing more trauma sometimes. Sometimes just to feel alive, sometimes to just get into fight or flight. You know, that's kind of the people who self-harm sometimes will talk about that. They do it to feel something over nothing because they want to at least not feel dead inside. And so we could do this with lots of simple exercises. You know, sometimes, you know, you might think breathing is over talked about in therapy, but it's the one part of our nervous system, our automatic or autonomic nervous system, that we have control over. Like, we can control our breath. And so I would start to help her figure out, you know, to breathe into her body, into her diaphragm. I have a video on that. And then also to even start to be aware of her sensations. When we live in this numb state, we often don't even know literally what we're feeling inside. Like, there's really good quotes about that Sally Rooney wrote. And so I would in session go, literally, what do you feel? Not emotions, because that ends up going into stories sometimes. If emotion, great. If you know you feel sad, great, tell me. But what does sadness feel like in your body? This is one of the most essential ways that we're going to heal trauma first and foremost. We have to know what's going on inside of us. And so coming back online, coming back to a sense of being in our own body. So she might say, oh, I feel this heartache. I feel this sadness. You know, I can feel my heart is heavy. I feel tight. Wonderful. Good. Breathe into that and then let it pass. Aware and then let it pass. And the way that we would really be working on her narrative that she's a bad person, first, whether she believes she deserves it or not, we'd be talking about self-soothing and self-care, because I have found, you know, in my 15 years of practice that when we abandon ourselves, when we neglect ourselves or mistreat ourselves, like her eating disorder, for example, it reinforces this idea that I'm bad, I'm untrustworthy, I can't even depend on myself. So I could start with even like, let's have a glass of water, you know, at one point in your day. If you're not drinking water, let's just have a glass of water. I'm not going to really focus here first, like the disordered eating. I'm gonna kind of go in the side door. Or, oh, you're scrolling at night, and why don't you, you know, go to bed 5 minutes earlier, turn off your phone, and just sit there and do some breathing exercises before you get in bed. Little ways to self-care, self-soothe. When you get a text from Connell that is upsetting to you, instead of responding or playing it off, sit there, feel your feelings, and maybe do something to take care of yourself first before you respond. Like, go on a walk, journal about your feelings, you know, comfort yourself. Like, oh, that was disappointing. You know, he didn't tell you this thing that he told someone else, and that really hurts. You feel excluded. And then, you know, in the beginning of my practice as a therapist, I really focus primarily on dialectical behavior therapy. That's what I was trained in, and it's still a big part of my practice, but I could get people to the point where they weren't hurting themselves anymore. They could take care of themselves. They practiced some self-care and self-soothing, like, you know, whenever they felt unhappy, they could do something calm and kind for themselves, but they just couldn't get over those stories that they were unlovable or a bad person or that they couldn't trust other people. And when I learned EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, that's when everything changed for me. I could support clients in not only kind of getting through the day-to-day in a kinder and safer way, but then I could help them move from these stories. So instead of they could go from, like Marianne, I think I'm a bad person, to I'm lovable and I deserve a healthy relationship. And, so I would do some EMDR sessions there. And literally, if you're doing that virtually, you're literally just following my fingers with your eyes, and your brain's going to heal itself. Like, traumatic memories get stuck. So like dad hitting me gets stuck. And so it feels like it's happening today, even though it happened 15 years ago, let's say. And so with EMDR, we can file those memories away. So it becomes a part of our past. And we just get to see the big picture. Like, yes, that was awful what my dad did, and I never deserved that. And moving forward, I'm going to make sure that I'm only with people who treat me with respect, because I deserve that. It just helps us see the big picture. It gets us out of this trauma story. And then finally, a third goal I would have probably with her is to develop a template of a healthy relationship. With her childhood home, with her dad, her brother, and her mom all being abusive, it makes sense she doesn't understand what a healthy relationship looks like. And we are designed to need belonging. So of course, if she thinks it's all about power, then of course she's going to be with men who try to dominate her or try to be submissive, because she wants a relationship and she doesn't know anything else given her abusive childhood. And so I will be teaching her that, healthy relationships are about equality. They're about partnership. No one wins and no one loses. You're on the same team. There is no such thing as a winner and a loser in a healthy relationship. We compromise. We're equals. If, we negotiate, that is a healthy relationship. They're in my corner. There's no violence. There's no cruelty, even if it's a game as it's framed in the book. And I never have to leave my own body to feel safe like she does with some of these men when I'm in a healthy relationship. Maybe it happens because I'm triggered about the past, but they're not actively reinforcing my trauma by doing hurtful things to my body, for example. And so these are the things that I would do as a trauma therapist who specializes in relationships and codependency to help Marianne from Normal People heal. And by doing this, I was able to feel more hopeful, because in the novel, if you've read it, it doesn't end on the most hopeful note for Marianne, but I like to think that that was just the middle of her story, as it was in her age and everything, and there's so much hope for her. If you've read the book, you have comments, you have thoughts about Marianne's healing, it resonates with you on your own healing journey, I'd love to hear in the comments, and I anticipate I'll be do more of these book reviews from a mental health perspective. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to connecting next time.